because from the U.S. standpoint, these are regional issues. There's not one country that's sending people to the U.S. certainly, but at least what I liked about it now, when I reflect back on it, it was constructive. It was discussing with governments. It was treating the sending country and the receiving country on a par with each other. I thought that was sort of refreshing, and perhaps a starting point for broader conversation in Europe.
Thank you very much, Anne. And as you spoke about that, I was reminded of a panel that we were on together in Istanbul, where a representative from the government of Cameroon, a poor country, was talking about how they had incorporated refugees from Central African Republic and northeastern Nigeria, given them land, allowed them to work, opened such social services as were available to them. And so people could support themselves rather than being a burden on their communities or a burden on the state. And so this is not just for rich countries. This is, I think there are many developing countries that could take advantage of the skills and the energies of refugees that are coming, particularly, skilled people fleeing are desperately needed in some sub-Saharan African countries. So Sahai's point about supporting host governments to incorporate refugees in their planning, I think, was a very important one.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Sahai's point is extremely important, because I don't think the international community is going to be able to absorb the numbers we're talking about. So we are going to have to find ways of helping the African countries, who are the primary hosts of these migratory movements, to cope better. And I think that's a very important element. I mean, in terms of legal migration, I mean, I absolutely agree, and the demographics in Europe are very clear. We will need more immigration. Of course, I will not hide from you that in Europe, as here, it's a politically difficult subject. It raises, we have to be honest about that. I mean, I think we have to be frank. There's no point in pretending that it's all, we are the world sensations. There are people who worry about what this will mean economically. Will people take their jobs? They worry about cultural differences. And I think one of the differences between, the United States is one of the primary resettlement locations in the world, and they do a brilliant job, and Anne and her team do a fantastic job from what I could see in her description the other day. But if I may say so, it has the luxury of being able to do it calmly and sort of, have a process. We have people turning up on the doorstep, literally needing immediate treatment, and that's the difference, I think, in terms of why this is a more complex issue for us. And the other point I think we do have to think about, but being Irish, again, I'm conflicted on this, is the brain drain. I mean, we don't want to create a situation where we are taking some of the best and brightest away from the countries that need them. Now, I say I'm conflicted because for many years, the largest item in the Irish economy was immigrants' remittances, money sent back from Irish people working, particularly in the United States, sending money back home, which was an important lifeline for many families until the Irish economy finally took off and achieved the kind of prosperity that we now see. So this is probably true for many African countries as well. So I think we need to provide that outlet, we need to provide that opportunity, but we do need to be careful that we are not, if you like, draining off the best and the brightest in a way that will be detrimental to development. And that's why I think this is why the dialogue between us is so important, and what the arrangement between Switzerland and Nigeria, frankly, we have those arrangements with many African countries and with the African Union. And I think we need to deepen that to get the balance right between the humanitarian aid, the development assistance, the economic opportunities, and legal migration, including the possibility of return of people who ultimately are deemed not to be in need of asylum or refugee status. And it's getting that right. But we also, I do think, need a global response. Europe alone will not be able to cope with this problem on its global dimension. We're very grateful for what the United States does, but frankly, I think other international actors could also be more active, and that's something I know both the EU and the US will be pushing in weeks to come.
Thank you very much, Ambassador O'Sullivan, and I'm very pleased to see that Representative Charlie Rangel has just joined us. Thank you very much for being here, sir. let me turn on that question to Tsahai. You in your initial remarks, you started this conversation, and if you'd like to add anything, I know we would benefit.
I think the orderly migration is very important, but we also need to see maybe how about orderly refugee resettlement. What I mean by that is, for example, many of the European countries that are taking immigrants now have not been participating in the refugee resettlement program. But all, countries like Switzerland, Holland, and so on, maybe they are taking a few hundred refugees in a given year. So what if, we have a system for refugee resettlement, increased resettlement by the European countries, and that may lessen, the need to migrate illegally. One of the factors, for example, even in our country here, well, if a refugee is staying somewhere in a camp, wait for a few years and so on, they can't really take it any longer. So what they do is they take any opportunity to flee somewhere else. Those who have the means, for example, would come to the United States in a tourist visa and would apply for asylum. Well, if we had increased our admission numbers so that refugees would be admitted legally here, then there would not be that need. So this is something that we need to take into account. I also want to mention, in terms of the recognizing the contribution of host countries. For example, Tanzania has been a host for many, many refugees for many years. Tanzania has now been very bold enough to integrate refugees from Burundi. It has provided them citizenship. It has provided them land for farming. I don't think the international media knows about it or wants to talk about it. That is something that we really need to highlight that, so that it will be an example for other African countries. Ethiopia, as poor as it is hosting a number of Eritrean refugees. The initiative it has taken, for example, there is a scholarship for young Eritrean refugees given by the Ethiopian government to attend, a number of universities in Ethiopia. This week, I heard they had announced that they would be admitting about 100 Eritrean refugees. In the last 2 years, 3 years, they have also done. Can we encourage those kind of interventions? I'm sure there are a large number of young, refugees in Kenya who desire, to go to school. Can we, spend some of our resources to encourage those kind of local initiatives?
Thank you very much. I knew we would get another very stimulating and constructive suggestion from you, Dr. Tefera, and given that education is one of the main motivating forces that leads people to leave the country where they are and try to get to a place where they can have their children in school or can pursue their own education. I think an initiative along those lines would be very, very welcome. Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary Richard, Ambassador O'Sullivan, Dr. Tefera, for these really stimulating and constructive remarks. I'd like to start the discussion period now. Just a couple of sort of housekeeping points. There is, as you see, a standing microphone, and please line up at the mics if you have questions or comments. I'll take 2 or 3 at a time to accommodate as many as possible, and then give our panelists a chance to respond to those. I would like to, if you don't mind, give Deputy Assistant Secretary Catherine Wiesner a chance to make a quick comment. If you would like to, Catherine, please go to the front of the line. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks, everyone. Maybe I can turn this around so that I'm facing the room. Let me start by also thanking Congresswoman Bass for her initiative to continue to highlight the African dimensions of what everybody is now recognizing as a global refugee and migration crisis, but one that is not new in many regions of the world, particularly Africa. And as my boss, Ann Richards, said, I did recently return from a trip to the Horn of Africa, where maybe I can just share a few impressions from that and some of my other travels about my conversations with government officials and how they there are seeing this whole dialogue. And the ambassador to the European Union went through some of the preparations for this summit in Valletta that's upcoming next month between the European Union and the African Union. And I can say, having been in Sudan and Somalia and Kenya, that the countries of the region are very much also preparing for and looking towards that summit. So to go through some of the themes that are will be focused on in the summit, the first is about the focus on the ability to seek asylum and protection within Africa, and that's very important and something which we support, as Anne has said, with our humanitarian assistance funding. President Kenyatta of Kenya recently won an award from CNN, and in his speech made some remarks about what he perceived to be some of the double standards about the management of borders and the closing of borders in other parts of the world, given the heavy pressure he feels he's been under from the United States and others to keep his borders open. As the ambassador to the EU said, this focus on the international responsibility, that we all have responsibility globally to receive people who are fleeing from war and persecution, I think is quite important, but also to reinforce what Dr. Tesfaye has been saying about what the quality of that asylum is in hosting countries. So it's a lot more than providing just basic food and shelter. It's giving people opportunities and hope. And there are, as Dr. Tesfaye has said, a lot of initiatives in that regard, even in the Dadaab camp, where so many Somalis are. There are some really innovative education initiatives. There's online learning. There are universities that are providing degrees in Dadaab. There are some really, really highly educated Somalis living in the Dadaab camp. When Secretary Kerry went in June, we set up a video link for him to talk to some of the secondary students who were in the top schools in Dadaab. And what they told him is that they really, really appreciated the opportunities for education they'd had, but the problem was then what next? That no opportunities for work, no opportunities to support their family, no opportunity to go anywhere else. And what he did is encourage them, to not give up, that your education is always important. You're making an investment in the future. You can't know when there'll be peace in Somalia, or you'll have an opportunity perhaps to go elsewhere, but to focus on their studies right now. The second theme of this summit, as I understand it, will be a lot around cracking down on egregious smuggling and trafficking practices. I recall a conversation I had with an official at the African Union some months ago saying, when it is a politically difficult conversation sometimes, these migration conversations between Europe or the United States and Africa, and sometimes there is a perception that what it boils down to is Europe or other industrialized nations wanting to basically stop people from coming, and that the African Union's perspective was wanting to protect the human rights of migrants. Well, interestingly, those things tend to intersect on this theme of smuggling and trafficking, because everybody can agree that smugglers and traffickers are often quite abusive of migrants, and that cracking down on them is in the interests of all. But I would also note that there are some tensions there. Anne mentioned I had been in Niger. The community of West African states has free movement of people. There are other parts of Africa and Central and Eastern that are also working on free movement of people. And they've done this for the same reasons that the European Union has created the Schengen zone, to increase economic integration and opportunities. But that can be at odds sometimes and create a tension with this focus on smuggling and trafficking, which looks at essentially controlling borders. Which is not to say that border management is not important. Clearly it is, and as the International Organization of Migration would say, there's a humanitarian type of border management that needs to be done, where victims of trafficking or abusive smuggling can be recognized, but free movement of people, as it's allowed by laws, is also incorporated. And then finally, on this issue of root causes, just to reinforce this conversation we've had about legal channels, obviously there needs to be a huge amount of investment in development dollars in job opportunities for young people in Africa who want to stay in Africa and pursue those opportunities. But I just came from Somalia talking to the Deputy Prime Minister, who highlighted his personal initiative to see much more scholarships, international scholarships for Somali youth, as well as channels for labor migration, recognizing that as much as they do to try to prevent and create opportunities at home, young people will always want to seek opportunity. And so I think this emphasis on legal channels is really, really important. It's hard. The numbers are often smaller than the demand, much smaller, and it's much more time consuming than people are necessarily willing to wait for. But looking in the long term is something that we have to focus our energy. So I'll stop there and leave it to these many, many questions here. But thank you all again for being here this morning.
And thank you very much, Catherine, for those very pertinent remarks, and particularly for giving us a perspective that you gathered on your recent trip in African countries. So may I please
Yes.
invite the first.
Good morning. My name is Bernadette Palo, and I want to thank you for the information you provided and commend each of you for the role you're playing in addressing this refugee crisis. My question really touches upon remarks made by Dr. Tefera and others, and it goes to the current conditions now in refugee camps and the disparity among them, so that you still see, even though we have refugee camps, as Dr. Tefera said, throughout the continent of Africa, this move to go to Europe. And if you can please tell me what the distinctions are, what the funding levels are, how they're treated when they arrive in Italy or Germany juxtaposed to other countries in Africa. And then the second part of that question is the duration of time, and is there a distinction between the time that they spend before they're repatriated in European countries juxtaposed to African countries where they may languish in refugee camps for a longer period of time before being integrated into societies? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Two big questions. Let's have the next, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Seguero. I'm the president of Hope for Tomorrow, an organization that focuses on conflicts and violence. Thank you so much, Congresswoman Karen Bass, President Obama, for carrying the good and bad package of Africa. My question and my comment is to Ambassador Sullivan. The problem, and Dr. Tesfa, the root problem is the African leaders. What is the African leaders and the African Union doing? They only come here to look for investment and funding. They don't talk about refugees, resettlement, and problems that are affecting Africa. What are they doing? And I'm talking as a civil society. Recently, we were at the State Department when Secretary opened the global diaspora. I was in the session of refugees. Refugees are staying like animals. Who has ever visited refugee in this place? Refugee camp. Carry up your hand if you have ever entered a refugee camp. These people are living like animals. I came up with a solution at the World Bank IMF spring meeting. I came up with a solution at the State Department, and we are talking here under Congresswoman Karen Bass. How do we collaborate? With me as a civil society. The diplomats are there. We have very few diplomats here. They are not concerned about the refugee, the immigrants. How do we work with you as civil society, as Africans concerned about the fellow Africans? I'm from Kenya. I've seen all refugees, Somali, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, everywhere in Kenya. So why can't we resettle those people in those countries, living in a better, dignified way than just taking so much money, time, and bring them perishing on the sea like this? We African leaders need to be blamed. And the African Union, we want to work with you, African Union, State Department, and the American government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those are two big questions, actually three. And I will come to that line. Let's take one from this side. And
all right,
and
I'll have two, I believe, short questions. One for you, Ambassador Sullivan. You talked about the African Union and the European Union having a conference coming up, and I'm wondering if they will address the issue of, how you distinguish first between a refugee and a migrant, because this has been an issue also within the media. How do we distinguish those two, refugees and migrants, and how do we address their issues? Also, I would like to mention something that Catherine has just mentioned here, and Dr. Tefera. I am also from Kenya, but I'm in the media with the Voice of America. And I've seen deplorable conditions in the refugee camps in Kenya. And Kenya hosts so many of those refugees from other countries. But one of the things that you raised, Dr. Tefera, is that they don't go to school. They don't have a learning opportunity at all. There are so many children born there. They don't become citizens. And now with the threat of Al-Shabaab, Kenya views Somali refugees sometimes with suspicion. How do you distinguish between the refugees who really need a place to stay, grow, find a skill, learn, and those who threaten the country? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Let's give our panelists a chance to respond to those. Current conditions in refugee camps and the disparities among them, particularly Europe and Africa, although I must say that conditions for refugees in Europe in recent weeks would make some of the conditions in refugee camps in Africa look pretty good. Anne, do you
Well,
want
I
to
think,
address that?
you know, some of the best camps in the world are the camps that the Turks set up along their border, where they had containers instead of tents that are can withstand the climate better year-round. You know, we're talking about refugees and migrants going to places where there's a really harsh winter, and so you need to have structures that can stand up to that, blankets, clothing. You know, that the requirements for surviving winter are just tougher than some of the sub-Saharan African camps. But what we've discovered is even if a camp looks nicer to our Western eyes in terms of, you know, how it's outfitted, that in both places we find refugees, especially young refugees, along the lines of what Catherine was talking about in the Dadaab camp, they find the life there after several years incredibly stultifying. So as donors, we're trying to save lives. But what's missing is the opportunity to enrich lives and help people discover lives worth living, where you have a well-rounded life and you're able to select a field that you'd like to go into and work and support yourself and support your family and have a family where you have hopes and dreams for your children. And so this is the part that no matter how the camp is outfitted and how much money is spent on a camp is proving to be, I think, the Achilles heel of camp life. And the other thing is that so many people are choosing not to live in camps and instead to live on the local economy. And we see this everywhere. Certainly in the region around Syria, more refugees are outside of camps than in camps, but Americans don't know that because of all the film footage shot inside camps where you can easily find and photograph refugees. And so it's forcing us to re-torque how we deliver services to refugees. They're not all just sitting together waiting for help to show up and dependent on that help. They're trying to make it on their own. They're trying to pay rents that sometimes go up when there's a big refugee influx. They're trying to work, which can be very dangerous. They can be subject to abuse and exploitation when they're off the grid, so to speak, when they're working in an underground economy and don't have work authorizations. Their kids, they'd like to send them to school, but sometimes that's easier or harder to do depending on where they are. I met these Somali girls in Nairobi. I'll just never forget them. They were working so hard to get ahead and had come out of Somalia on their own. And the amazing thing to me was that the Somali community there had taken them in, you know, because I kept saying, are you living with relatives? And they were like, no, but we're with friends and people. And so to me, they were the most precarious young women, but they wanted to go to school. They wanted a life. And I think this is the piece that is really challenging us, you know, but what we're trying to do is get ATM cards out to people to help them pay that rent rather than just say, you have to go live in a camp.
I think that's very important to realize that the vast majority of refugees don't live in camps, which again highlights the importance of working with the host communities and allowing refugees to be a source of stimulus rather than a burden on those communities. On the question of the how you distinguish between refugees and migrants. I think that was addressed to you, Ambassador Sullivan.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, if I may just, on the camps issue, I mean, I agree entirely. The problem is camps should be temporary solutions. They should not become, but then they have a tendency to become permanent solutions. And then, frankly, there is an issue of funding. I think the US and the EU have a very good record of funding the international agencies. Other international actors, frankly, have less good records, and I think that's one of the things we do need to address. But it's true that we don't want the camps to become the permanent solution. On the other hand, they have to be decent. I mean, one of the challenges, Kathleen, you're a bit harsh, I think, to say that some of the conditions for refugees in Europe are worse now than in camps. I mean, precisely we did not wish, and we have never in Europe, in receiving refugees, tried to set up camps. We have always tried to integrate people into the sort of fabric of society. And the sheer numbers have made that extremely difficult now. You take an island like Lesbos, which I think has in winter a population of about 80,000 people, has seen a throughput of 300,000 refugees in the last couple of months. I mean, how can this infrastructure possibly cope? Particularly when, to be frank, many of the people arriving there explicitly say, I don't want to stay. I actually want to go somewhere else. So there's a kind of catch-22 situation here of, do you make them comfortable when they don't even want to be there? So I think, so we need to look at that, and I agree entirely that ultimately you have to give people a perspective. On the difference between refugees, I beg your pardon, and migrants, look, this is an international agreement. Under the UN Convention, there are very clear criteria, boxes to be ticked, and you go through an interview process, you check whether people are at risk to their lives for persecution, etc. So I think it's actually not that complicated. I mean, it is, of course, it's always a human drama because it comes down to making a judgment about a person and a family. So in that sense, it's always, but we have very professional people who are trained to do this. We do it in close cooperation with UNHCR. So I think we are capable of making that distinction. And the difficulty, I agree, arises when you decide that people are not actually refugees, but in fact are economic migrants. And then the question is, what happens to them in that situation when you have a new human drama of do you return them to which country, or do you give them an opportunity nonetheless to settle? And that's something that we're going to have to work our way through in the next few months, because we take, on average in Europe, about 4 months to process an asylum application, which is, I think, relatively quick compared to other systems. But nonetheless, even during those 4 months, people have to be housed and looked after correctly. On the more general point about African leaders, we spend a lot of our development assistance, not a lot of our development assistance, but we invest heavily in the issue of governance, in the issue of discussions about how best to manage countries. But of course, at the end of the day, this comes down to politics within each of the countries. We are very supportive of the rule of law, of democracy, transparency. But of course, you also have to work with regimes which don't necessarily embrace those principles if you want to actually get something done. So getting that balance is, the great drama of international relations, if I may say so.
Thank you. Sahaya, I wonder if you could provide a little bit of insight on the question of how governments can work with civil society, since you are a great example of civil society working with governments. And is there any advice that you would sort of give to either side of that?
Well, I think this is a question, for many of the African leaders. They seem like to be competing with the civil societies for the small funds, resources. So the question is, would I be better off doing it myself or doing it? I think the international community, the donors, would have to make really a stipulation that would encourage the civil societies in any development, whether it be refugee assistance or local development, unless there is that kind of a conditionality from the donors. Many African leaders would basically do it themselves and marginalize the civil societies. So, question to my hope for tomorrow, nobody is really absorbing the African leaders. As I said earlier in my remark, they are responsible for what is happening in the migration or refugee situations. They are the causes. There is no doubt about it. If we had, a rule of law, governance, and the rights, economic policy, development, and so on, I don't think we'd have found ourselves in this kind of crisis. So no one is absolving the African leaders. They are part and parcel of the problem, and the hope is that they should be part and parcel of the solutions, with the international community engaging them positively.
Thank you very much. And you are perhaps too modest to talk about the role that diaspora organizations can play in this, with both encouraging host governments and countries of origin to address these issues, as you have done. So let's have one question here, and then I'll go to this side.
Hi, my name is Susan Tellingater. I'm a development professional. I just came back from 6 years in West Africa. I just wanted to make one brief comment, and maybe people have a response. There's another issue that happens, I feel, which is a false narrative. In these countries, people in these countries are not well informed about what happens when you try to make the precarious journey overseas. And once they arrive in these refugee areas, they don't tell their families the truth because of shame and various other factors. And so there is this perception that, you know, hey, make the great journey, get a great life, you know, and come on over. And I think maybe we need to do a better job of communicating in these countries what exactly happens when you make this risk and go overseas.
That's a very good point, and I know the International Organization for Migration and others are making an attempt to give refugees themselves more of a voice in describing what this is like. Sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Nia Kwete. I work with the African Immigrant Caucus. I would also like to thank Ms. Bass for doing this. I think this is very needed. My question is to Secretary Richard and Ambassador O'Sullivan. Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned frank discussion and sensitive issues. I have to tell you, I think that the European Union is not just doing enough. And particularly, it is true there are a two-tier system. When you look at what is happening with the Middle Easterners going through Eastern Europe and what is happening with the Africans going through Libya, the US and the European Union intervened in Libya. Libya is still broken. I think that it is wrong to look at the situation as just people smuggling. And in terms of, my question would be, before this conference, are the European leaders going to tell their population that we bear some responsibility because we broke Libya? And before that, Libya, Colonel Gaddafi was cooperating closely with the Europeans, investing there. So I think that the Europeans are just not doing enough and ignoring the problem. Madam Secretary, President Obama spoke at the UN and mentioned this intervention in Libya and that enough was not done. So I think even the US needs to help the Africans coming through Libya a little more. My question to you is, there are also the Liberians and the West Africans who've been here because of Ebola and their own civil wars. Could you please talk about how they are viewed and what are they going to be forever in a temporary status? Thank you.
Thank you. Sir.
Hi, thank you very much for your comments today. I really appreciate you all coming, and this is tremendously informative. My name is Steve Anderson. I'm a retired Army Brigadier General, and I'm now a owner of a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business in Knoxville, Tennessee, and working with a company called Omni Housing. My question is, what are we doing to leverage emerging housing technology to deal with the problem of refugees throughout the globe, and particularly in Africa? As we all know, 80% of Africa lives in substandard housing. And I would submit to you, we wouldn't have the problems we have with refugees if we can put people in a home, a place that people can be proud of, a place that they can grow their family, educate their children, and thrive, a place where we can build entire communities and grow economies. It all starts with a basic building block of a home, a quality home. There's new technologies out there that just aren't being leveraged. There's not the incentives that we need to get people, and not just people like me, but others that have these incapabilities. What are we doing to specifically address this issue of providing better quality homes to the people of Africa and ultimately to the refugees that are being displaced and on the move? Because they stop being a refugee, I submit to you, when they have a home.
Thank you for that very interesting comment. I work a lot with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and they've had a very interesting project in cooperation with the IKEA Foundation with modular homes, sort of pop-up homes. You've all probably put together IKEA furniture, and this is a flat pack house, which is a pretty high quality. So thank you for that very interesting comment. And I'd like to ask if our panelists would like to respond to the question about the EU not doing enough and the responsibility for the Libyan situation. Secretary Richard or Ambassador O'Donnell, would either of you like to respond to that? I think the other two were comments, although if you have an answer about using new housing technology, would be interested in that as well, of course.
Well, I think, people can judge for themselves whether they think the European Union is doing enough. I mean, I think huge efforts have been made to deal with an extremely difficult situation. And I think enormous compassion and humanity has been shown. But I mean, the fundamental point about interventions, political interventions in the case of Libya, it's true. We intervened in Libya, and it resulted in the downfall of Colonel Gaddafi. But even if we had not, there was a civil war raging. I mean, we didn't intervene in Syria. And we still have a civil war raging. So, I mean, I don't think it's quite as simple to say that it's the intervention that causes the problem. The fact is, after the Arab Spring, or the Arab Awakening, as I think many Arab people prefer to call it, there was a situation of huge instability across North Africa and the Middle East, and that was going to generate its own problems. And it is true that in Libya there has been a particularly bad situation of a breakdown of law and order. We have been working very closely with the UN Secretary General's Special Representative, Bernardino Leon, and the US and other international partners, and I think we are slowly putting things back together in Libya, and we can hope for some improvement there. On the question of whether there is some distinction to be made between refugee seekers or asylum seekers coming from sub-Saharan Africa or Syria, frankly, I don't really see where this is coming from. I think the numbers are roughly 750,000 people have come through, have reached Europe. About 250,000 are coming from sub-Saharan Africa. They are treated in exactly the same way. It just depends the countries where they end up. It is true we talk more about the Syrian situation for obvious reasons, but as I've said very clearly, the European Union is fully seized of the fact that this is a global phenomenon and that the African dimension is hugely important and is structural and is not going to go away. And that's why we're engaging in the conversations in Valletta, because we absolutely need, with the African Union, with the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, to have a sensible dialogue about how we best make use of the considerable resources we are making available in order to address the root causes, the issue of African countries themselves who are facing large influx of refugees, and how we deal with the refugees who eventually find their way to Europe in the most humane and correct way possible, also in the best interests of Africa. So I take the point, but I actually think Europe has quite a good story to tell in face of something which is a remarkable new crisis. I think very few other countries faced with those kind of numbers on their doorstep would have reacted much better than we've been able to do.
On the false narrative, this is really perplexing, I think, our colleagues in the U.S. government who try to communicate with the public at large, because the interesting thing about the migrations today is that how many people have cell phones. So they have the technology to get information from relatives and from the U.S. government and from their own government, but they don't always choose to what they choose to believe, is a harder thing to design and influence. And I recognize immediately this very human thing of having made such a difficult journey and then perhaps not having succeeded initially in the places to which you've arrived. The need to send a note back that says, everything's great, I'm fine, I'm driving my car around and have that big job. I mean, every possible culture does that, I think. So I think what you've put your finger on is a truly difficult issue that bedevils our public diplomacy colleagues. In terms of the two-tier system, I think it's not how you treat differently people from point of origin so much as it is people's personal stories. If you're fleeing a conflict, a major conflict that has the world's attention, I think it's easier to make the case that you are a bona fide refugee. If you're fleeing criminality and poverty and hopelessness, I think it's harder to make the case under current international law. And so we see this in the U.S. with people coming up from Central America crossing our southern border, where it's very dangerous right now for young people in the northern triangle of Central America, but they may not qualify as refugees because they're not fleeing a war right now. They're fleeing criminality and drug gangs and horrible behavior that can be just as deadly as a war, but it doesn't fit our refugee definitions. So this was an issue in Istanbul, was is there another category somewhere between economic migrant and refugee that is deserving of protection that we don't quite have the tools to get our hands around and provide help for? So that's a dilemma. Thank you for mentioning the TPS program, Temporary Protective Status for West Africans. I am aware that the longer people stay in the U.S., the more they put down roots, the more at home they feel, and so it'll be more difficult for them to return to their original homes later. So I don't have anything brilliant to say about that, but I appreciate that this is both a humanitarian gesture on the part of the U.S., but it also then in some ways creates a dilemma for later on. And General Anderson, thank you for telling us about the housing technology issue. There's a lot of struggle right now with how do we spur innovation in a way that it actually makes a difference to people and it can be brought to scale in these crises. I'm a big believer in a few basics like clean water and vaccinations and food deliveries that help people live. And I think there's a lot of hype around innovation. But that said, we have to be open for those things like Plumpy Nut that all of a sudden are saving millions of lives and are truly innovative. So I really wrestle with this one because I hear a lot of hype about we've got this product and we've got this type of stove and we've got this, but then the things that really save lives year in and year out tend to be some basics. Plastic sheeting, vaccinations, high-energy protein biscuits. So people like me have to stay open for those nifty new things that can make a difference. And then there's also a strand of person, often found on Capitol Hill, who chases after the latest high-tech item, but it's not perhaps gonna really come to scale in the field.
It is a dilemma, and those questions of taking innovations to scale, I mean, there are some really promising things, but often we are so busy saving lives, I mean, and that has to be the first priority, that it's difficult to give them the attention and the resources that might bring out their real potential. Please.
Hello, my name is Tinsaye. I'm from Ethiopia, and my question is sort of two or three based on sort of my attention on the root causes. I feel like Africa's generally neglected